They say a lake keeps secrets the way a safe keeps cash, quiet, heavy, and sure of itself. Mine was like that most mornings, wrapped in a thin scarf of mist that slid across the surface and vanished with the first touch of sun. I wasn't thinking about rules or neighbors or anything with a clipboard. I was thinking about bass patterns and how the water felt like it was breathing in slow, contented lungs. I balanced my thermos on the fence post, tightened the cap on the bait oil, and started down the gravel. Halfway to the shore, the scene bent sideways. A woman stood in my driveway, heels planted, blazer pressed, mouth fixed in that expression you only see on people who believe the planet spun just to give them something to supervise. A plastic badge flashed across her lapel, edge curled, corners, whitened like an old playing card. I slowed. She didn't. "Excuse me, sir," she said, already annoyed that I hadn't stopped a step earlier. "This area is restricted. Lake access is governed by the Lakeside Homeowners Association. Do you live here?" I looked at her, then at the lake, then back at her. "Ma'am," I said, "I'm standing in my own driveway." She hugged a clipboard to her chest like it was a shield. "I'm Heather Collins, president of the HOA. Non-residents pay a day use fee. You're not on our roster." "President," I repeated, as if the syllables were exotic. "That badge is expired." I pointed to the tiny date at the bottom. 2 years gone. She jerked the badge closer to her body as if modesty would make the numbers disappear. "The roster isn't public," she snapped, "for privacy. But if you submit payment today, we can avoid citations." "Citations," I said, trying not to smile. The mist over the water thinned. A heron stepped from reeds to mirror. "Heather, what exactly do you think you're in charge of?" she answered by tearing a yellow carbon copy from the pad and extending it like a priest with a wafer. "Code 12A, unauthorized lake entry. You'll need to pay the $50 fee and a $75 administrative penalty. Total due today, $125. I didn't take the paper. I pulled out my phone and tapped record. The red dot stared back at us. She clocked it, chin lifting. "You can't film me," she said reflexively. "I'm in my driveway," I repeated, and let the record catch the way her eyes flickered toward the cul-de-sac where a silver sedan idled like a getaway car. She waved her free hand. Moments later, a locksmith van and a tow truck rolled up, big vinyl logos screaming professionalism. The locksmith stepped out, took one look at me, then at the metal property stakes that marched the boundary line like small soldier pins. "This your driveway?" he asked. "Every inch," I said. He nodded to the tow driver. "We're out." The tow guy lifted a hand in apology and backed away. Heather started talking faster, words like liability and emergency access and county code spilling from her like beads from a snapped necklace. The men left anyway. The sedan idled, then eased away, the sun glinting off a windshield that needed wipers more than authority. Across the street, Sophie Clark stood on her porch with a coffee mug balanced in both hands, the universal pose of someone watching a storm that might veer east if she prays hard enough. She offered me a small, sympathetic shrug. A few houses down, George Miller folded his arms and glared as if that glare were a binding ordinance. "The neighborhood forum will hear about this," Heather announced, tucking the clipboard under one arm with bureaucratic flourish. "And there will be a vote on enforcement next Tuesday." She pivoted like a parade drum major and stalked to her car, the heels of her shoes clicking out a Morse code message that translated roughly to, "I get my way." I stood there with my fishing rod and a knot in my line and a feeling in my gut that told me this was chapter 1 of a book I hadn't ordered. The lake breathed. A fish teased the surface and sank with a wink of tail. I started recording a little monologue to myself, a habit that's both insurance and therapy. Date, time, interaction with self-appointed authority figure at my driveway. I panned to the property markers, then to the water, then to my house. The one Elaine never saw because cancer is a thief. By lunch, the harassment metastasized. Not citations taped to the door this time, but phone calls to my shop. I own a tackle and fly store in town, a place with photographs of men and women grinning under brims, hands outstretched to show a fish before the release. A place that smells like coffee, cedar shavings, and a little bit of river. 3 regulars walked in that afternoon and walked out without buying a thing. One of them, a retiree who's bought nothing but my hand-tied spinners for 5 years, kept his eyes on the floor like I'd turned into a hazard sign. He avoided my eyes. "Saw something online about environmental violations," he murmured, and the words hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, though that mattered, because the lake had stitched me together when I'd come apart. The first summer, my father was sick. He'd still take me to Miller's Pond before sunrise. Thermoses, the clank of old tackle boxes, the quiet companionship of a man whose hands were already learning to shake. He taught me the kind of patience that has nothing to do with waiting and everything to do with listening. When Elaine died 3 years ago, every city sound became an alarm. Horns, sirens, laughter that wasn't ours. I came here to a parcel, whose legal description read like a pirate map. Degrees and minutes, iron pins and old oaks, and found a place where the wind didn't push, it wrapped. I learned how to breathe again by listening to water, how to be alone without being lonely by sitting with quiet that didn't feel like judgment. So yes, the accusations stung. I started looking at Heather's forum posts the way a guide studies. Water, angles, currents, traps you can't see unless you've fallen into them before. She'd uploaded photos of shoreline trash, matted vegetation, what she called illicit fire rings. The comments piled up like driftwood, disgraceful, selfish, thought this neighborhood had standards. I saved every image, ran the metadata, and smiled without humor. Location stamps from the opposite shore. Timestamps that predated my early morning routine by weeks. I knew the hands that had placed those stones because they weren't mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind ticked dried seed pods against the window screen. Outside, the lake wore the city's reflected stars like borrowed jewelry. Around 2 a.m. A small truck rolled slow along the far slope and stopped behind Heather's fence line. I watched from the dark with my camera peeking through the curtain. Bags of soil, rolls of irrigation tubing, decorative stone that always looks better in catalogs than in yards. The red IR dots on my cameras blinked like heartbeat monitors, while men hustled what looked a lot like environmental cleanup materials straight into the president's backyard. In the morning, I drove to the county line coffee shop where Mark Lewis likes to hold court over eggs and statute numbers. He's an old friend, college roommate, now a lawyer with a sense of humor dry as kindling. I slid my phone across the table and let the video loop. "Your HOA president is doing some late-night gardening," he said. He watched it again, this time paying attention to the license plates. "Family operation?" "George's brother-in-law's company," I said. "Miller Landscaping. They've been paid by the Lakeside Community Fund," I air-quoted. "There's a receipt on the forum, which would be fine if the community fund existed in actual law." Mark wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and leaned back. "Remind me how you bought the place." "County auction, courthouse steps," I said. "I thought I was getting a small lot with lake access. The legal description, well, I don't speak compass." "You brought the deed?" "I have a copy at the house," I said. "I know the shoreline is mine. The water, look, I'm not trying to be king of a puddle. I just want to fish in peace." He steepled his fingers like he was about to deliver a sermon to a wayward but salvageable soul. "Daniel, there's a difference between an HOA and a woman with a laminator and a complex. There's also a difference between a covenant and a neighborhood rumor that puts on a tie. If there's a real HOA, there will be incorporation papers. Bylaws, elected officers, annual financials, you've seen any of those?" "Not a one," I said. "Just flyers with clip art, a badge older than my boots, and a forum that thinks a vote in George's living room is the same thing as law. He nodded. Then we stop arguing feelings and start verifying facts. Back at the house, I organized everything like I was laying out flies before a hatch. Videos, photos with metadata, screen captures of posts, a spreadsheet Sophie emailed when she realized I was not the enemy, listing the dates she'd paid lake access fees for 2 years. I knocked on her door and asked the thing nobody had asked, why she believed Heather. "Because she sounded like somebody who knew things," she said, cheeks pinking with embarrassment. "Because it was easier to pay 50 than to make a scene. Because George agrees with her, and George has that tone that makes you feel like your yard is on trial." "Do you still have receipts?" I asked. "In a folder," she said. "I'll bring it by." George found me on my front steps with a bag of groceries, pinching my fingers white. He angled his body to block the path like a human road-closed sign. "You making trouble?" he asked, tone measured like he'd practiced it into something that felt like civility. "I'm making coffee," I said. "Want some?" He ignored that. "You're new here," he said. "We have standards. Community standards. We don't rock boats." I glanced past him at the lake that used to be a glacier, and now was a mirror, and later would be a memory in somebody's phone. "George," I said, "has anyone shown you the HOA's official filings?" "Heather handles administrative matters," he said quickly. His eyes flicked to my phone like it might jump out and bite him. "It keeps values up when someone's in charge." "That's the thing," I said. "In charge of what?" He didn't answer, because he couldn't without tugging at a thread that would have unraveled his certainty. He left with the groceries, and I stood there with the echo of our conversation clinging to the porch rails like humidity. By the time the emergency meeting rolled around, Heather's dramatic word, not mine, the community center smelled like folding chairs and anxiety. 30 people, give or take. Someone brought cookies that nobody ate. Heather had turned a donated table into a command center, poster boards with arrows and red circles, a laptop plugged into a projector, the clipboard that I was starting to suspect might be fused to her arm bone. She opened with language like a lawyer and gestures like a magician. "Ongoing violations, shared resources, ecological stewardship." She pointed at me when she said non-compliance, and the room turned like a sunflower to face the heat. The slideshow bloomed. Litter, bent grass, a blackened ring of stones that did not belong to this place. "Dates?" I asked. She blinked. "The first tell. Metadata is available upon request," she said, which is like saying the check is in the mail, but in tech. "Great," I said. I stepped forward with a calm I borrowed from my father's hands. I plugged my phone into the projector and flipped. Through my series, same spots, different angle, timestamps marching in crisp order, the long view that makes little lies feel small. Then I showed the receipt. Lakeside Community Fund, $200 for environmental cleanup, vendor Miller Landscaping and Irrigation. The next photo showed the logo on a truck. The next showed that truck tucked into Heather's driveway, like a guilty thought. Silence is a sound when it gathers all at once. George whitened. Sophie set down her mug without sipping. Somebody in the second row whispered, "Oh, so help me out," I said, palms open. "Is the fund paying to protect shared waters or to water one yard?" Heather tried to yank the narrative back with words like contractor, stewardship, and necessary. But doubt had already walked the room like a friendly dog, sniffed shoes, and decided who it liked. The questions came fast, pointy. "Where are the bylaws? Who elected you? What account holds the money?" Heather offered to form a task force to review processes. It sounded like building a bigger clipboard. She ended the meeting, not by adjournment, but by flight. The next morning, there were flyers on every mailbox about habitat protection and a temporary ban on lake access. Orange mesh fencing popped up along the shore like cheap surgery. Trucks arrived with county seals I'd never seen before. Men in vests photographed reeds and wrote on pads and moved cones in patterns that felt like choreography for a play with. A budget, but no script. The optics were perfect. A dangerous man, a fragile habitat, a brave president who called in experts. My cameras caught something else. Daylight deliveries to the assessment site, after hours offloading at Heather's. Soil, stone, plants with price tags that would make a wedding planner blush. I clipped the footage, stamped the time, wrote the notes. And then I sat in my truck outside my shop and stared at my hands until my knuckles went from white to normal. Maybe the easiest thing in the world would be to pay a fake fee to a fake fund to a fake president and get my neighbors back. Maybe the hardest thing would be to keep my back straight and let the facts do their work. Mark called that afternoon with a voice like a man who'd opened a door and found gold. "I pulled records," he said. "I want you to listen to me. Carefully." I waited. The lake breathed on the other end of the line, a sound I imagined rather than heard. "You didn't buy access," he said. "You bought the parcel. Daniel, you own the whole lake." The world did not tilt, but my balance shifted. The fence post, the gravel, the thermos I'd balanced there every dawn, they were suddenly coordinates in a map with lines that ran a lot farther than I'd drawn in my head. I looked toward the water as if it might nod back. Across the street, Sophie stood on her porch again with her coffee, watching the men in vests measure a shoreline they didn't control. George pretended not to watch me watch them. The orange mesh flickered in the wind. Somewhere a heron laughed the way only herons can, as if all of this were absurd, which of course it was. "Mark," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. "How sure are you?" "County sure," he said. "Survey sure. Auction deed sure. Come tomorrow. We'll print the maps and circle every inch in red." I hung up and set the phone next to the thermos and let the fact sit with me in the last light. There's a feeling when the line goes taut and you know what's on the other end isn't just weight, but will. That's how it felt. A pull I couldn't ignore. The lake kept its secrets well. But apparently, so did the deed. Section 2. The county clerk's office smelled like old paper and ink that had seen more signatures than conversations. Mark was already there when I walked in, tapping his pen against a stack of files that looked like they'd been pulled from a vault rather than a cabinet. The woman behind the counter wore glasses on a chain, her hands moving with the rhythm of someone who had filed the same form 1,000 times before. "Parcel number 478, she said, pulling a manila folder thick with cross-references. "Auctioned last spring. Winning bidder, Daniel Harris." She slid the folder across the desk with the kind of finality you only get from a government stamp. The survey was crisp, red boundary lines circling not just shoreline, but the water itself and 50 feet beyond in every direction. Mineral rights, water rights, recreational rights, all there in black ink, signed, sealed, and waiting for me to notice. I ran my hand over the paper like it was a relic. My lake, not theirs, not shared, not subject to a woman with a badge that had expired. When gas was $1 cheaper, Mark whistled low. "Congratulations, Daniel. You don't own access. You own the water." The ground shifted under me, but not in the way earthquakes do. More like the way a truth reorders the map you've been using, and suddenly you realize the roads you thought were borrowed were always yours. By evening, I had 20 photocopies in a folder and a new kind of resolve in my chest. I knocked house to house, letting neighbors see the county seal and survey coordinates with their own eyes. Sophie studied the map, her coffee cooling untouched on the table. Her face moved through confusion, anger, then relief. "So all those fees," she said softly, "they weren't real?" "Not a dime of it," I said, her mouth pressed into a line that wasn't quite a smile. I knew something felt wrong, but Heather was so official. George was a harder sell. He opened his door just wide enough to glare through the chain lock. His voice was clipped. You're destroying order. George, I said, holding up the stamped pages so the light caught the seal. Order built on fiction isn't order. Fraud. The door slammed. That was his answer. The next night, Heather waited by my truck like a character from a cheap noir novel. Phone in her hand, posture sharp as if documentation could reverse the truth. You're intimidating residents, she sneered. I'm sharing public records, I said evenly, though adrenaline buzzed in my blood. Records that show you've been running a fraud. Her eyes darted, searching for the next angle. Harassment charges, restraining orders. The threats were heavy, but behind them I saw panic. She knew the paper in my folder was more powerful than any clipboard she held. The cameras I'd installed began catching more. Trucks arriving at night with soil, mulch, expensive plants. Not to a public site, but to Heather's backyard. My cameras blinked like silent witnesses while men unloaded supplies that were supposed to be for lake habitat restoration. Fraud, filmed in high definition. I typed notes every night, my fingers tapping the phone screen with precision. Dates, times, license plates. I had evidence now, not just suspicions. Evidence that Heather had transformed environmental activism into her personal ATM. But the more proof I gathered, the more the neighborhood shifted against me. Coffee shop whispers, customers canceling orders. Sophie more cautious, her conversations hushed. George outright hostile, spreading the story that I was trying to privatize a resource meant for everyone. Heather's posts on the forum framed me as a villain, a man against the environment, against community, against neighbors. And people believed it. Lies travel faster than proof, especially when the liar carries herself like authority. Mark warned me, she's going to escalate. Probably try legal maneuvering, restraining orders, anything to stall until she can twist the narrative. He was right. Flyers appeared overnight. Environmental emergency, habitat at risk, lake closed for assessment. Orange barricades rose like prison fences. Trucks with county logos, real or faked, I couldn't yet tell, parked along the shoreline. Men in vests roped off areas, photographed reeds, scribbled on clipboards. From a distance, it looked like a state operation. To the Yob community, it looked official. To me, it looked like theater staged to destroy my credibility. George parroted Heather's claims at the grocery store. Ecological damage, he said loud enough for everyone in produce to hear. We can't let one man ruin what belongs to us all. His words had weight, not because they were true, but because repetition hardens lies into something people lean on. Sophie avoided me now, her face flushed when I waved. My shop grew quieter by the day. Calls dropped. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw me coming. The isolation was its own punishment, more corrosive than any fine. That's how these schemes work. Make resistance costlier than compliance. But then Sophie slipped into the booth across from me at the coffee shop, her eyes darting to the door as if someone might see. She slid her phone across the table. Screenshots. Contractor receipts. Payment schedules. More than I had guessed, stretching back 5 years. Heather had been siphoning money under the guise of environmental fees for half a decade. Landscaping, irrigation, even interior renovations, funded by neighbors who thought they were protecting a lake. One message stopped me cold. A text from Heather to a contractor. Keep the pressure up until he caves. Milk the environmental angle. He won't last. There it was. Strategy spelled out in pixels. Not authority, not governance. Extortion with a green mask. That night, I sat in my truck reviewing the footage, the receipts, the screenshots. The evidence was a fortress, but the cost was mounting. Friends gone, business crumbling, neighbors convinced I was the villain. Alone, with a folder of truth against a network of lies. David versus Goliath, But this Goliath had the crowd on its side, cheering. "Tomorrow," Mark had said, "we go before the county." A hearing, commissioners, legal observers, a place where facts matter more than flyers. I closed my eyes, breathing with the lake's rhythm in my head. One thought kept circling, insistent and sharp. This fight isn't about fish, or even land. It's about whether truth can survive in a neighborhood built on fiction, and in that moment, I knew come morning I'd either break Heather's empire or she'd break me. The county public hearing room didn't look like justice at first glance. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the walls were beige, and the chairs were the folding metal kind that make everyone shift after 10 minutes. But there was a gravity to the space, rows of neighbors, reporters scribbling in the back, a panel of 3 county commissioners seated behind long desks draped with the state seal. A court reporter tapped keys steadily, every syllable sinking into the record. Mark leaned close, his voice low but certain. "Facts will win today. Just stick to the evidence." Across the aisle, Heather sat with her attorney, a polished man with a gray suit and sharper cheekbones, plus 2 of her contractor relatives who looked like they'd rehearsed their scowls in the mirror. She looked unshaken, like a politician, before a friendly crowd, but her eyes betrayed something else when they flickered toward me. Commissioner Sarah Martinez cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the whispers. "This hearing has been convened to address complaints of fraudulent HOA activity and misuse of county environmental resources. Mr. Harris, you filed the petition. You may begin." The microphone in front of me gleamed like a dare. I set the folder on the table, my hand steady, though inside my chest felt like a storm was pounding against glass. "Commissioners," I said, "this isn't complicated. I own the lake." I let the words hang there. The room buzzed with whispers, but I didn't flinch. I pulled the first exhibit from the folder, the county auction deed, stamped and signed. I slid it across the table. Then the survey map with red circles, every boundary marked, water rights, buffer zones. Commissioner Martinez flipped through the papers, her brow lifting. She glanced at her colleagues, then back at me. "For the record, this documentation confirms that Mr. Harris is the sole legal owner of Parcel 478, including the water body and surrounding buffer." Gasps rippled through the room. Sophie, sitting 2 rows back, clapped a hand over her mouth. George shifted uncomfortably in the front row, his notepad trembling in his lap. Heather's attorney leaned in to whisper rapidly in her ear. "I didn't. Stop." "Second," I said, pulling out the spreadsheet Sophie had helped compile. "Here's where the so-called HOA fees have gone." I laid down bank statements, contractor invoices, and receipts. Over $18,000 collected for lake maintenance and environmental protection. None of it spent on community projects. All of I tapped the papers, diverted into landscaping, irrigation, and improvements on Ms. Collins's personal property. Heather's face flushed, but she raised her chin, trying to recover. These funds were legitimate contributions, she insisted, her voice echoing too loud in the mic. "Community stewardship requires investment." Martinez's eyes narrowed. "Do you have incorporation papers for the Lakeside Homeowners Association, Ms. Collins?" Heather shuffled through her folder, but the sound was hollow, like someone pretending to search for treasure in an empty chest. Her attorney stepped in smoothly. "The HOA has operated informally, Commissioner, with community consensus. Formal filings are in progress." "Not true," I cut in, sliding my final document across the table. "I conducted an incorporation search with the county clerk. There are no records, no bylaws, no filings, no HOA. Ms. Collins has been impersonating a governing body that doesn't exist." Silence. Pure and heavy. The kind of silence that changes things. Heather stammered. We followed community traditions, not legal technicalities." "Fraud," Mark said calmly into his mic. "This is fraud." The commissioners leaned together in hushed consultation, their faces tightening. The court reporter's keys rattled faster, and then came the blow that knocked Heather flat. Commissioner Martinez held up one of Sophie's screenshots, the damning text messages. She read it aloud, her voice steady. "Keep the pressure up until he caves. Milk the environmental angle. He won't last." A collective gasp rolled through the crowd like a wave. Neighbors twisted in their chairs, eyes darting between Heather and me. Sophie dropped her gaze, ashamed she'd once believed. Even George looked shaken, his certainty splintering. Heather lunged for the microphone. "Those texts were taken. Out of context. I was enough," Martinez said firmly. Her voice silenced the room. "We've seen enough." She turned to me. "Mr. Harris, this panel recognizes your ownership of Parcel 478 and affirms that you have full legal rights over the lake and its usage. The alleged HOA is not incorporated, not recognized by this county, and has been operating under false pretenses." Then she faced Heather. "Ms. Collins, you are hereby ordered to cease all collection of fees, dismantle unauthorized signage, and provide full restitution of funds collected. Additionally, you are fined for impersonating a community officer and misusing environmental enforcement channels. You will also perform 200 hours of verified community service at the very lake you claim to protect." The gavel cracked down. The sound echoed like thunder. Heather's mask cracked. Her attorney whispered frantically, but she looked like someone who had been stripped naked in public. The clipboard that once felt like a weapon now lay limp on her lap. She mouthed something to George, maybe a plea, maybe a warning, but his face was pale, his allegiance shaken. I exhaled. For the first time in weeks, a full breath that didn't catch halfway. The weight of the lake shifted back into my chest where it belonged, but even in victory, I knew this wasn't over. Heather wasn't the kind of woman who surrendered gracefully. She would find another angle, another scam, another mask to wear. And as I gathered my papers and walked out into the sunlight, the crowd buzzing behind me, I realized this lake had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a battleground. The morning after the hearing, I woke to the sound of metal against metal. For a second, I thought it was just my wind chime catching the breeze, but when I stepped outside, coffee steaming in my hand, I nearly laughed at what I saw. Heather Collins, former queen of clipboards, was crouched by one of the HOA restricted access signs at the edge of my driveway. She wore jeans and work gloves instead of her blazer. A socket wrench wobbled in her grip as she tried to unscrew bolts rusted into place. Sweat dripped down her forehead, her hair clinging in damp strands. This wasn't theater. This was penance. The county order had been specific. Heather herself had to remove every fraudulent sign she'd installed, and I was required to document it for compliance. "Smile for the camera," I said evenly, raising my phone. She shot me a glare that could have curdled milk, but she didn't argue. One bolt squealed loose. The metal sign sagged, then dropped into the dirt with a flat clang. Every sound was music. Every sign that hit the ground was a chord of justice. Neighbors gathered quietly, drawn by curiosity and a sense of poetic balance. Sophie crossed her arms, sipping her coffee with undisguised satisfaction. Even George hovered on his porch, trying to act indifferent, but watching every turn of Heather's wrench. By noon, a small pile of dismantled signs lay stacked like tombstones, each one a marker for the authority Heather never actually had. She wiped her face with her sleeve, chest heaving, and for the first time since I'd met her, Heather Collins looked small, but the humiliation was only the start. The county had hit her with fines totaling over $30,000, a combination of restitution, penalties, and legal fees. Every dollar she'd siphoned from her neighbors, plus interest, had to be repaid. The irrigation system in her yard, the one installed with stolen lake fund money, was ripped out and repossessed. Trucks hauled away decorative stone and landscaping she'd flaunted for years, transferring it all to the county parks department. Her silver sedan, once polished to showroom shine, was sold to cover part of the debt. By the end of the month, she was driving an old, dented hatchback that coughed more smoke than respect. And then came the community service. Every Saturday morning, Heather reported to the lake she once claimed to own. No blazer, no badge, no clipboard. Just work gloves, a rake, and a fluorescent vest issued by the county. Under the supervision of a park ranger, she cut invasive plants, shoveled gravel, repaired walking trails. Sometimes she picked up trash along the shoreline, bending again and again under the weight of a punishment more honest than anything she'd ever imposed on others. I stood on the dock more than once, fishing rod in hand, pretending not to notice, as she dragged bags of weeds to a dump pile, but I noticed. We all did. Sophie brought donuts for the volunteers one morning and made a point of skipping Heather's outstretched hand. George, red-faced and stiff, showed up to help hammer new signs into place, signs that welcomed residents instead of threatening them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very people who once parroted Heather's rules were now building something better in her absence. We called it the Lake Advisory Council, not an HOA, not a power grab, just a group of neighbors with clear rules and public books. Fishing and swimming were free for everyone, but we agreed on guidelines: waste disposal, fire safety, wildlife protection during nesting season. Transparency was the rule. Quarterly reports were posted online. Every dollar accounted for, and, most importantly, leadership was elected openly, with ballots and signatures, not whispered into existence in Heather's living room. The first sign we raised together was a moment I'll never forget. A polished wooden board with engraved letters, "Welcome to Harris Lake, a community resource. Respect the water. Respect each other." I held the post while George drove the bolts, his jaw tight but his eyes soft with something like apology. Sophie stood nearby, recording the moment with her phone, her smile genuine for the first time in weeks. Neighbors clapped when the sign went up, not because of me, but because something rotten had finally been cut out, and what replaced it was clean. Heather kept her head down through it all, her punishment public and unrelenting. But even stripped of her illusions, she couldn't resist small jabs. Once, as she bagged trash by the shoreline, she muttered just loud enough for me to, "Here, enjoy your little victory, Daniel. Communities always need leaders. When they realize you can't keep order, they'll come crawling back." I didn't answer. I just cast my line and let the reel sing. Because the lake didn't care about her threats. It belonged to me, yes, but more than that. It belonged to the mornings, to the herons, to the quiet. The truth was a better leader than Heather ever could be, and little by little, people started to see that. Sophie apologized one evening as the sun bled orange across the water. "I'm sorry I doubted you," she said, her voice catching. "Heather made it sound so official, and I didn't want to be the troublemaker." "You weren't alone," I told her. She counted on that, on silence, on people not asking questions. George came too, weeks later, carrying a letter he'd written in neat, slanted cursive. He admitted he'd been blinded by the illusion of authority, by the comfort of someone else handling the details. His brother-in-law's company was under investigation now, and his loyalty had cost him more than pride. "I let myself be used," he confessed. "I won't let it happen again." Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was possible. Because I knew what it felt like to want order so badly you'll believe in anything that promises it. That autumn, the lake felt different. Lighter. No barricades, no orange mesh, no fear, just ripples, laughter, and the sound of hammering as we built a dock that actually served the community. I paid for the lumber, George supplied the labor. Sophie brought coffee for everyone who helped. The transformation was quiet, but it was real. Heather, meanwhile, faded into the background of the very neighborhood she once dominated. Her voice no longer carried weight. Her clipboard gathered dust. Every time she bent to pull weeds under the ranger's supervision, every time her old car rattled down the street, it reminded people what happens when you build your power on lies. But I knew her well enough by then to understand she wasn't finished. People like Heather never believe the story ends without them winning. Somewhere behind that work vest and forced humility, she was plotting the next move. The lake shimmered in the fading light, calm on the surface but deep enough to hide anything. And I wondered, had I truly won, or had I just forced Heather to play a longer game? The first frost of winter glazed the lake like spun glass, thin and delicate, the kind that shatters under the weight of a pebble. I stood on the dock, breath clouding in front of me, thinking maybe, just maybe, the storm was over. But Heather, Collins wasn't built for surrender. It started with whispers online, anonymous posts on community forums claiming I'd misled the commissioners, that I'd bribed Sophie for her receipts, that my deed wasn't valid. Then came the flyers, tucked under windshield wipers at the grocery store, protect our lake from greedy outsiders. The irony of being labeled an outsider while standing in my own driveway would have been funny if it wasn't so desperate. Neighbors rolled their eyes, but the tension returned. George stopped by one evening, holding one of the flyers like it. Was radioactive. "She's at it again," he muttered, shame still hanging on his voice. "Some people are listening." Heather's last play came in January when the county called me back for a follow-up review. She'd filed an appeal, this time leaning hard into the environmental angle. She brought in a biologist for hire who claimed fishing activities were destroying nesting habitats. She had charts, graphs, even drone photos of supposed erosion damage. But what she didn't know was that my cameras had been rolling the whole time. When her biologist claimed erosion caused by unauthorized fishing trails, I played footage of Heather's own contractors dragging supplies through the same areas. When she showed drone photos of debris, I presented time-stamped video of county trucks offloading that same debris into her yard. And when she repeated the line about shared natural resources, Commissioner Martinez asked her calmly to produce HOA incorporation papers. Again, Heather had nothing. The panel wasn't amused. They didn't just deny her appeal, they expanded her penalties. More fines, extended community service, a formal recommendation to the state attorney for investigation of fraud. Her lawyer left the room without a word. Heather sat frozen, her face a mask cracking down the middle. That was the day she broke. The neighborhood shifted permanently after that. People stopped whispering her name like it carried authority. She became a cautionary tale, the ghost of power built on paper walls. Her Saturday service continued, but now nobody pitied her. Kids rode bikes past her while she raked leaves, laughing in the unfiltered way only kids can. Sophie shook her head every time we passed her, murmuring, "Justice has a funny sense of humor." By spring, Heather sold her house. The silver sedan was gone, replaced by a moving truck. She didn't say goodbye. Nobody waved. The neighborhood exhaled, like air leaving a balloon that had been stretched too tight for too long. And the lake, my lake, settled back into what it was always meant to be. That summer, we held the first official lake community gathering. Not an HOA, not a sham. Just neighbors, food tables, kids running barefoot along the shore. We grilled catfish, told stories, laughed under strings of lights hung between trees. Sophie organized a bake sale for trail maintenance. George, now the loudest voice for real transparency, read the first quarterly financial report aloud. 2 pages, every dollar accounted for. People clapped like it was fireworks. I stood by the water with my rod resting against the dock, listening. Not to speeches or arguments, but to the lake itself. Gentle waves against the posts, laughter bouncing across the surface. The sound of belonging, not forced, not purchased, not dictated by a woman with an expired badge. When the sun dipped low, Sophie handed me a coffee and asked the question everyone had been circling. "Do you feel like it's yours now?" I looked at the red stakes still marking the boundaries, at the engraved sign gleaming in the twilight. "It always was," I said. "The difference is, now everyone knows it." Because the truth about Heather was never just that she lied. It was that she convinced others to believe those lies, to hand her power she never had. And the truth about me was never just ownership. It was the willingness to fight when silence would have been easier. Some nights, when the moon stretched silver across the water, I thought about the cost. Lost business, lost friends, weeks of being treated like a villain. But then I'd hear the splash of a fish breaking surface, the sound of kids skipping stones, Sophie's laugh carrying over the water. And I'd remember what my father taught me at Miller's Pond. Patience isn't about waiting. It's about listening. The lake listens back. Heather's story ended in silence, her name nothing more than a bitter taste on flyers left to rot in recycling bins. My story with the lake still unfolds, every dawn a fresh page, every ripple a reminder. I told her once, "I'm not in your HOA." She didn't believe me. But the truth is carved deeper than any badge or clipboard. This lake is mine, and some. Things, no matter how many lies are piled on top, will always belong to the ones who fight for them.